So the first core we're going to look at in this virtual core workshop is the Mendel 36-4. This one is located here on our base map to the further to the southeast. It's the well on the left on the cross section here on the right side of the slides. This core is taken in the lowest part of the study interval, in the CDC-clastic dominated interval, which is at the base of the Wolfram B or in the Wolfram C. Here on the left side of the slide is the well log curve for the well 36-4. The core interval is highlighted by this dashed box. So this core is actually split in two. It's about 50 feet at the bottom and 60 at the top, separated by a 30 feet gap in the middle. Gamma ray here is on the left track, colored from 0 to 150. Black curve is the resistivity, red curve is the sonic. So the core is actually missing most of the low gamma ray interval that is in the middle of that interval with high resistivity and somewhat high velocity. If we look at Ian Moody core description, we don't see any big carbonates or debris bed, not even a big sandy unit in the middle. So we don't know the nature of that gap in the middle, but that's what creating that low gamma ray. On the right of the slide here is Ian Moody core's description with the lithology, XRD column, clay content, TOC, and then XRF element, aluminium, silica, carbonate, and magnesium. So we see on this core description that the core is mostly muddy with a thin strike of coarser grain material, mostly CDC-clastic one, and then at the top there's one very fine bed of carbonate. On average, the clay content is about 20% throughout the core interval. TOC range from 1 to 2%. The aluminum and silica curve are on average about 10 and 30% respectively. Carbonate content is really small except a few interval. Magnesium is about a few, 0.5%, 2% throughout. We're going to look at these two intervals in detail in the next walkthrough. This is a photograph of the core boxes. The boxes at the bottom is the bottom core interval. There's a big 30 feet gap in the middle, and the photograph at the top of the slides are for the upper part of the interval. So for the bottom part, if we just look at the color here, a pretty dark gray interval except for a few 10 centimeter interval that are tanner and correspond to grainier interval. And in the upper part, we see a couple of thicker interval that are lighter color. One at the bottom with 10 and a 30 centimeter tan interval, then back to gray CDC-clastic mudstone, and then toward the top here we see more and more light gray interval that are coarser grain, and then another gap, a little bed, and then back to mudstone. So now we'll go. The first 30 feet or so of this core is dominated by CDC-clastic mudstone and siltstone with occasional small dialer turbidite. The CDC-clastic mudstone are faintly laminated. Here's a thin section example of this facies. We can see there's a lot of muds and organic matter, as well as silt-sized to very fine-grained sand-sized quartz floating in this multi-matrix. Intercalated within the CDC-clastic mudstone, we find several centimeter to millimeter thick thin dilute turbidite. Here's an example of one with a little erosive base and capped by sideritic red mudstone. The thin section here on the left show you the coarser silt-sized to very fine-grained sand-sized particle at the base grading upward in the sideritic mudstone. So let's move up a little bit. Here's another example, one of these thin dilute turbidite. This one seems like it had ripples on top of it, and then it's capped at another layer of sideritic mudstone. Here's another example, the thin discontinuous dilute turbidite. And then the next one here, with the thin section photo on the left, shows sort of maybe an erosive base with the coarser silicified material capped with the silicized laminated mudstone, and you can clearly see the difference in the thin section between the coarser base and the laminated top. As we go up, we have a few more of those thin turbidite, and then we find here the first evidence for soft sediment deformation, and about half a feet above that there's this 10 centimeter thick bed. This is skeletal packstone to grainstone. In thin section we see that it's mostly crinoid fragments, quite a bit of quartz, but it is totally silicified. You can see on the XRF here on EN core description that it's barely registered in the calcite, and a little bit of magnesium blip on the curve, but it's just silicified. Here's another one of these centimeter thick silicified bioclastic packstone to grainstone. Then in siliciclastic mudstone to siltstone above that, on this view here we see a lot of white speckle in the dark mud. And if we zoom in here, we can see that those are little clast and bioclast floating in the mudstone. And on thin section, we can see that the mudstone are laminated, and those carbonate bioclasts like this fuselinide here are just floating in those laminated mudstone to siltstone. As we move up, we see those light color interval. If we zoom in, the first one here is clearly a little bioclastic silicified carbonate turbidite. It's totally certified. I don't know whether it's reverse grading or just the silicification went below the turbidite. And then the next one seems to be again certified or silicified mudstone, and seems to have been reworked by soft sediment deformation. Above this we can see a color change in the mudstone. They become much lighter, maybe due to an increase in carbonate content in the system. And then we have a 30 feet core gap here between those two boxes on the core description from Ian Moody. This is where we here are now, and we're going to start looking at the upper part of the core. And then as we move up, we start to see a lot of this dilute turbidite again. Here's an example of probably silcide quartz ripple turbidite, and then just above that there's a bioclastic, maybe some lithoclast. I can see some pyrite in there. It's a little sharp base bioclastic carbonate turbidite. Above this interval of more dilute turbidite, then there's two tan layer in the core. One is about 10 centimeter thick, the other one is a foot thick, about 30 centimeter thick. Those are these two sandstone turbidite on the Ian core description here. The lower one is made of medium grain sandstone, which is crudely laminated, maybe ripple at the base, and then capped by a set of thin millimeter to centimeter rippled sandstone turbidite too, and then back into pelagic siliciclastic mudstone. The second gravity flow deposit start with laminated medium to fine grained sandstone. We saw this nice water escape dish structure above it, and then some rippled glass, and then it grade upward into these tan finer grain silicified siltstone, and probably some carbonate content in that, and then grade upward into the siliciclastic mudstone with carbonate fragments. Then this is capped by a muddy carbonate debrite with large crinoid fragment, and smaller one, other bioclast and lithoclast floating into this siliciclastic mudstone matrix. A lot of deformation and evidence that this was a cohesive flow. On the fin section, you can see there's a fair amount of silt size quartz in the matrix, as well as those crinoid fragments. This whole interval here is dominated by cohesive flow and debris. We can see large lithoclast fragments flowing in the matrix, crinoid fragments, and then occasionally we have a little more grainy flow, like the one here. We can see on the fin section that it has some little foram and crinoid floating into a pretty muddy, silty matrix here. This part of the core is dominated by siliciclastic mudstone with about 20% clay content and 1.5% TOC. Here in the mudstone succession we see evidence for erosion and inclined bedding, so whether it's a little slump or an erosional event later filled by pelagic accumulation is unclear here on the core. As we move up the core, we see some concretion and other evidence of soft sediment deformation. And in this interval, we see an increase of frequency of gravity flow. Start with those thin sandy matrix, laminated sandy turbidite with sometimes ripples. And then we have this 3-foot massive bed here of medium to coarse sandstone. Has a little bit of soft sediment deformation at the base and is pretty structureless for the rest of the turbidite. Above that we got some more siliciclastic mudstone with debrites and carbonate fragments. Then we have a core gap here, and then just above it we have a 10 centimeter bed of bioclastic red-nominated packstone with crinoid and fusilinid, and then capped by some pretty dark siliciclastic mudstone. Some of the mudstone that had up to 20% clay content and up to 2% TOC at the top of the core here. So to recap what we see in that core, it's siliciclastic mudstone dominated core, a lot of silicification of the carbonate unit that are present in form of thin dilute or 10 centimeter bed grainy turbidite. There's a couple of thicker sandy unit that are turbidite too, medium to coarse grain sandstone, some debrite at the top of the core, and then a couple of gaps in there. We still don't know what the gap in the middle is made of. We'll have to discuss that maybe with the next core.